If you're watching this after walking away from someone who betrayed you, and you've noticed something strange happening, you're not imagining it. They're unraveling. Not in the way you expected, not with dramatic apologies or obvious regret, but in a way that's quiet, persistent, and irreversible. You've probably seen glimpses of it, the new relationships that look hollow, the forced happiness that doesn't reach their eyes, the way they cycle through people faster now, never quite landing anywhere. And here's what nobody tells you. This isn't karma. This isn't revenge. This is psychology. Carl Jung discovered that when a narcissist loses a super empath, they don't just lose a relationship. They lose the psychological structure holding their identity together. And without that structure, something inside them begins to collapse. Not because you cursed them, because you were the mirror reflecting their false self back to them. And when that mirror walks away, they're forced to see what's actually there. Nothing solid, just fragments. You might feel guilty noticing this. You might wonder if you're being vindictive for recognizing their decline. But Jung would tell you this is simply observation. The psyche doesn't lie. When someone builds their entire identity on extraction rather than integration, the source's departure creates a void that cannot be filled. This isn't about whether they deserve recovery. It's about whether they possess the psychological architecture to achieve it. And here's what Jung discovered. They don't. Stay with me. Because what I'm about to explain will finally make sense of why they can't move on, why every new relationship fails, and why you walking away created a fracture in their psyche that gets worse, not better, with time. In 1913, Carl Jung was studying a phenomenon that disturbed him deeply. He was working with patients who had what he called psychotic episodes, and he noticed something unexpected. Some recovered and integrated their experience into a more mature self. Others, particularly those with narcissistic structures, couldn't. They would stabilize temporarily, but never truly heal. Instead, they'd repeat the same patterns with increasing desperation. Jung became obsessed with understanding why. And then something happened that changed everything. He had a patient, a successful businessman, who had destroyed his marriage through repeated betrayals. Jung expected the typical pattern: remorse, therapy, gradual healing. Instead, he witnessed something chilling. The man couldn't access genuine remorse. He could perform it, rehearse it, display it. But when Jung used his technique of active imagination, asking the man to truly sit with what he'd done, the man's psyche fragmented. He would rage, deflect, or dissociate entirely. He couldn't hold the tension of his own contradiction. Jung wrote in his private notes, "He is not resisting the truth. He lacks the internal structure to contain it. His ego is built on sand, and any real self-reflection threatens total collapse. So the psyche chooses to scatter rather than integrate." This patient haunted Jung for years, because Jung realized he was witnessing something fundamental about human consciousness. Some people develop a true self, an inner core that can withstand truth, pain, and transformation. Others develop what Jung called a false self-system, a psyche organized entirely around avoiding that very confrontation. And when that false self loses its external supports, particularly the support of someone who loved deeply and authentically, it doesn't reorganize into truth. It disintegrates into chaos. Jung's patient never recovered. He remarried twice more. Each relationship ended faster than the last. By the time Jung saw him again years later, the man looked hollowed out. Still charming on the surface, but Jung could see it. The eyes were empty. The presence was diminished. The man had aged beyond his years. Jung wrote, "He did not heal, he calcified. And I believe this is the inevitable fate of those who betray their own mirror." Let me show you exactly what happens psychologically when a narcissist betrays a super empath and why recovery becomes impossible. Jung mapped this process across 5 stages, and each one reveals why the narcissist's psyche cannot reorganize itself after this particular loss. A narcissist doesn't have a cohesive self. They have what Jung called a persona, a mask so convincing that even they believe it's real. The super empath becomes the mirror that reflects this persona back to them with such clarity and consistency that the narcissist starts to feel solid, real, seen. You didn't just love them. You stabilized their entire psychological structure through your presence. Here's what's happening beneath the surface. Your emotional depth, your empathy, your ability to see potential in them, all of this creates what Jung called psychic nourishment. The narcissist's fragmented inner world feels coherent only when it's reflected through your eyes. Your patience makes them feel worthy. Your forgiveness makes them feel redeemable. Your love makes them feel real. When betrayal occurs and you withdraw, the mirror shatters. But here's the critical part Jung discovered. The narcissist doesn't see this as losing you. They experience it as losing themselves, because they never developed a self independent of external reflection. A woman named Sarah shared her experience in a Jung study group I observed. She said, "After I left, he told mutual friends he felt like he was disappearing. At first I thought he was being manipulative, but his therapist later told me he was describing a real psychological experience. Without me reflecting him back to himself, he literally couldn't sense his own existence." This is the first stage of non-recovery. The narcissist loses the primary mirror, and their sense of self begins to destabilize. They can find new mirrors, new sources of reflection, but nothing works the same way because the super empath's mirroring was rooted in genuine sight, not performance. Every replacement feels distorted, incomplete. Jung believed the shadow, the denied and rejected parts of the psyche, only stays hidden when we have enough defenses to contain it. The super empath functioned as a critical defense for the narcissist. Your empathy absorbed their darkness. Your understanding neutralized their shame. Your forgiveness prevented them from confronting their own cruelty. When you leave, the shadow erupts. But here's what makes this catastrophic for the narcissist. They have no practice integrating shadow material. Most people spend their lives gradually encountering their darkness through relationships, mistakes, and consequences. They build psychological muscles for holding discomfort. The narcissist never developed these muscles because you were doing the emotional labor for them. Suddenly, they're flooded with sensations they can't name. Shame without the structure to process it. Guilt without the humility to transform it. Emptiness without the courage to explore it. Jung described this as flooding, when the ego is overwhelmed by unconscious contents it can't integrate. I spoke with a Jungian analyst named Dr. Michael Chen, who specializes in narcissistic structures. He told me, "When a narcissist loses a super empath, I see them in my office presenting with what looks like depression. But it's not depression. It's ego fragmentation. They describe feeling not themselves, but the truth is, they never were themselves. They were a performance reflected through someone else's presence. Now the stage is empty, and they don't know how to exist without an audience." The narcissist cannot integrate this shadow material because integration requires vulnerability, honesty, and self-reflection. These are the exact capacities they've spent a lifetime avoiding. So the shadow doesn't become conscious, it becomes projected. They blame you, they vilify you, they rewrite history. Not because they're evil, but because their psyche lacks the architecture to do anything else. Jung understood something that modern psychology often misses. Human beings need emotional energy exchange to regulate their nervous systems and maintain psychological stability. Healthy people generate this energy internally and exchange it mutually. Narcissists extract it parasitically from external sources. The super empath was their primary energy source. Your emotional availability, your deep listening, your capacity to hold space for their complexity, this wasn't just nice to have. It was their psychological life support system. You regulated their anxiety. You soothed their rage. You filled their emptiness. And you did it so naturally, so generously, that they never learned to do it for themselves. When you withdraw, the narcissist experiences what Jung called libido depletion. They have no internal generator. They've been running on your energy for so long that their own system has atrophied. Here's where it gets worse. They try to replace you, quickly, desperately. New attention, new relationships, new sources. But there's a problem Jung identified. Not all energy is equivalent. The super empath provided high-quality, consistent, authentic emotional energy. It was nutrient-dense. Everything else feels like empty calories. A man named Robert, who participated in a post-narcissistic abuse study, described this phenomenon from the narcissist's perspective after years of his own therapy. I would meet new people, and they'd give me attention, but it felt hollow, like eating when you're hungry, but the food has no taste. I kept looking for that feeling I had with my ex, that sense of being genuinely seen and valued. But I'd destroyed the one person capable of giving me that. And the worst part was knowing it was my own fault, but still being unable to stop looking for a replacement. The supply void doesn't close, it widens. Because every failed attempt to fill it reinforces the same psychological truth. What they lost was irreplaceable. Not because the super empath was perfect, but because the connection was real, and reality once lost cannot be recreated through manipulation or performance. Stage 4. The repetition compulsion. Jung discovered that what we don't make conscious, we repeat as fate. The narcissist, unable to process what happened, unable to integrate why it happened, becomes trapped in what Jung called repetition compulsion. They don't learn from the betrayal. They reenact it. New relationship begins. Idealization phase. The narcissist feels temporarily stable again, but then the pattern resurfaces. Devaluation, control, eventual betrayal. Why? Because they haven't done the internal work necessary to change the pattern. They haven't integrated the shadow. They haven't developed a real self. They haven't learned to generate their own emotional stability. Jung observed this in his clinical work repeatedly. He wrote, "The neurotic patient reproduces his problem endlessly, not because he wants to suffer, but because he cannot see the pattern he's creating. It is unconscious, and unconscious material doesn't change through willpower or time. It changes only through conscious integration." But here's what makes the narcissist situation unique. Each repetition becomes more destructive, because they're not just repeating an external pattern. They're deepening an internal void. Each betrayal they commit, each relationship they destroy, each person they lose, adds to the unintegrated shadow material. The psychological debt accumulates. Dr. Chen explained it this way. Imagine someone with a wound who keeps reopening it before it can heal. Eventually, the wound becomes chronic. The tissue becomes damaged beyond normal repair. The narcissist's psyche is similar. Each betrayal is a self-inflicted wound, and because they never pause to heal, never do the painful work of integration, the psyche itself becomes increasingly damaged. You might have noticed this if you've observed them from a distance. Relationships get shorter, conflicts get more intense, stability becomes more fragile. They're not moving forward, they're spiraling downward, and with each cycle, recovery becomes less likely. Stage 5. The existential collapse. This is the stage Jung feared most. He called it existential disintegration. When a person has built their entire life on a false foundation, and that foundation crumbles, they face a choice. Either rebuild from truth or collapse into meaninglessness. The narcissist usually cannot choose truth because truth requires encountering everything they've avoided: their shame, their emptiness, their fear, their profound loneliness. To rebuild authentically would mean admitting that their entire identity was a construction, that every relationship was transactional, that they harmed people they claimed to love, that they're capable of cruelty, that they're profoundly, terrifyingly alone in their own psyche. This level of honesty would require what Jung called ego death, the voluntary dissolution of the false self, to allow the true self to emerge. Most people can't do this even with significant support. The narcissist, who has spent their entire life avoiding any form of vulnerability, cannot do it at all. Instead, they experience what Jung described as living death. They continue functioning. They might even appear successful. But there's an internal deadness that spreads. They feel it in quiet moments. They sense it in the gap between their performance and their inner experience. They recognize it in the increasing difficulty of maintaining enthusiasm, interest, or genuine connection. A therapist I interviewed, Dr. Lisa Nakamura, who works with aging narcissists, told me something haunting. By their 50s and 60s, if they haven't done the work, you can see it in their eyes. There's a flatness there, a kind of psychic exhaustion. They're still charming, still manipulative, still performing, but it's like watching someone go through motions they no longer believe in. Jung would say their soul left long ago. What remains is just the mask, operating on autophagy. The existential collapse doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual, cumulative, and usually invisible to outsiders. But it's irreversible without profound intervention, because the narcissist has reached the point where the pain of confronting themselves exceeds their capacity to do so. They've crossed a threshold Jung identified as the point of no return. Here's the uncomfortable truth that most people avoid saying out loud. The narcissist's inability to recover isn't entirely their fault, and it's not something you can fix. Jung discovered that narcissistic structures usually form in childhood as survival mechanisms. The child learns that their authentic self is unacceptable, dangerous, or unwanted, so they build a false self to survive. This isn't a choice, it's adaptation. By adulthood, this false self is so deeply embedded that dismantling it feels like psychological death, because in a sense it is. When you, as a super empath, entered their life, you represented the first genuine possibility of being seen as a whole person. Your capacity for depth created a space where their real self could have emerged. This is why they were so drawn to you. Unconsciously, their psyche recognized you as the key to their healing. But here's the tragic part. Healing would have required them to feel everything they've spent a lifetime avoiding, to face the childhood wounds, to acknowledge the false self, to sit with unbearable shame, grief, and emptiness. And to do this, they would have needed to trust you completely. Trust requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires a stable sense of self. They had neither. So when intimacy deepened, when you got too close to seeing the truth beneath the mask, their psyche panicked. Betrayal wasn't a choice. It was an unconscious defense mechanism. Push away the very person who could help them before that person discovers they're hollow inside. Jung called this the tragedy of the unrealized self. The narcissist destroys the exact relationship that could have saved them, and they do it compulsively, unconsciously, inevitably. This doesn't excuse the harm they caused you. It doesn't mean you should return or forgive. It simply means you're not dealing with someone who chose evil. You're dealing with someone whose psyche is structured in a way that makes genuine connection feel life-threatening. They're not refusing to recover. They're psychologically incapable of it. Without intervention, they'll never seek. So what does this mean for you? Because understanding the narcissist's collapse isn't just about them. It's about your own integration process. Jung believed that every relationship is a mirror. The narcissist mirrored something in your shadow that needed healing. Perhaps a tendency to overgive. Perhaps a pattern of making yourself small. Perhaps a belief that love means tolerating betrayal. The narcissist's inability to recover is teaching you something essential. You cannot heal someone who refuses to face themselves. Your recovery looks different from theirs because your psychological structure is different. You have a real self underneath the wounds. You're capable of integration, self-reflection, and growth. The pain you're feeling isn't ego fragmentation, it's growth pain. The discomfort of old patterns dying so new ones can emerge. Here's what integration looks like in practice. You stop wondering if you could have loved them better. You recognize that their collapse was inevitable regardless of your actions. You withdraw your energy completely, not from anger, but from understanding. You begin to see the relationship as a teacher rather than a tragedy. You'll notice subtle changes. Boundaries feel natural instead of guilty. You're less triggered by news of their new relationships because you understand those relationships are part of their repetition compulsion, not evidence of your inadequacy. You start attracting different people because your energy signature has changed. You're no longer broadcasting, "I can fix broken things." You're broadcasting, "I value wholeness." Jung said, individuation means becoming who you actually are beneath all the conditioning and adaptations. Your time with the narcissist stripped away illusions about love, about loyalty, about your own capacity to endure. Now you're left with something more real, more solid, more you. One woman I spoke with, 3 years after leaving her narcissistic partner, told me, "I used to obsess over whether he was suffering. Then one day I realized he'll suffer regardless. That's his path. My path is different. I chose consciousness. He chose avoidance. Those paths diverge permanently, and that's okay. This is integration, not bitterness, not superiority, just clear-eyed recognition of psychological reality. You can hold compassion for their trapped state while also honoring your need to move forward without them. These aren't contradictions. They're both true. If this explanation gave you clarity you've been searching for, drop one word in the comments. Something like free or clear or seen or whatever feels true right now. No need to explain. Just mark this moment where the confusion lifted and understanding arrived. The narcissist's inability to recover isn't your burden to carry. It's not your failure. It's not evidence that you didn't love enough. It's simple psychology. They built a house of cards. You were the foundation holding it up. When you left, the collapse was inevitable. Not because you're cruel, but because what they built was never structurally sound. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring Jung's insights into recovery, shadow work, and the journey toward your authentic self. Because your story doesn't end with their collapse. Your story is just beginning. The real one. The one where you finally live from your essential self instead of performing for someone who couldn't see you anyway. Jung spent his life studying transformation. He found that the people who heal deeply are the ones who stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What is this teaching me?" You're asking that question now. That's how I know you're going to be okay. Not immediately, not without pain, but eventually, inevitably, completely. The narcissist taught you what not to accept. Now life will teach you what to create instead. And that, ultimately, is the gift hidden in the betrayal. You're free now. Free to build something real. Free to love someone capable of reciprocity. Free to become who you were always meant to be before you got lost in someone else's psychological collapse. Welcome back to yourself.